Well, what's aldosterone do? Aldosterone makes you retain sodium, excrete hydrogen ion, and excrete potassium. Aldosterone makes you retain sodium and excrete hydrogen ions and excrete potassium. You retain sodium at the epithelial sodium channel, the ENaC, in the late distal early collecting duct. And also, the principal cells make you get rid of potassium. The intercalated cells excrete hydrogen ions. The principal cells excrete potassium. The principal cells with the potassium. So you retain sodium and excrete either hydrogen ions at the intercalated cells, potassium with the principal cells. It makes you retain sodium and excrete hydrogen ions. With the hydrogen ion with the intercalated cells, potassium with the principal cells. Now, the sodium action of aldosterone is not just at the kidney. It's also happening at salivary duct, sweat, and colon. Now, we actually make more saliva on average than urine. It's just we don't notice it because we swallow it and recycle it. But to have an effect on aldosterone and sweat glands and colon is colossal importance because it means it's not just the kidney. Epithelial sodium channel absorbs sodium and water. The principal cells excrete potassium. The intercalated cells secrete hydrogen ions. Now, this image is not just the kidney. This image can also be the gut. This is both the bowel and the kidney. The luminal end, aldosterone puts in sodium receptors at the luminal end and stimulates the sodium-potassium ATPase on the blood side, on the basal membrane side. Yes, we have to know that there are two types of cells there. That's why we're being able to either excrete the potassium or excrete hydrogen ions, because the principal cells are with potassium and the hydrogen ions are with the intercalated cells. Now, this system with carbonic anhydrase is the same system in many different parts of the body. It's the same system in our blood when we buffer off acid and base in and out of every red cell. That the importance of this cannot be overestimated, that aldosterone makes you reabsorb sodium and water and excrete hydrogen ions or potassium. Aldosterone makes you reabsorb sodium by stimulating the sodium-potassium ATPase on the basal membrane. The net effect increases sodium absorption, which pulls water in with it. Now, this is part of the reason why people with hyperaldosteronism don't have high sodium levels. They don't have high sodium levels because they're absorbing sodium and water. So you get a high blood pressure. So you get sodium and water so that these sodium levels don't go up. The other thing is that the volume expansion stimulates atrial natriuretic peptide, so you excrete sodium and water from the kidney. This regulates our extracellular volume by using sodium, and also creates, when you're absorbing all these cations, it makes the lumen negative, and that negative lumen literally yanks the potassium out of you through the principal cells. So when you reabsorb sodium, it makes, when the cations come out of the lumen becomes negative, and the negative lumen pulls potassium out of the body. And when this mechanism about the hydrogen secretion by intercalated cells is broken, what is that called when that mechanism is broken? When that mechanism is broken, it is called a distal RTA. So if you have either the mechanism is broken, that's a distal RTA. When you don't have aldosterone, it's called type 4 RTA. That usually happens in diabetics, hyporenin, hypoaldo. And when that epithelial sodium channel works too much, what if it's working too much and you're absorbing too much sodium? What disease is that called? When the epithelial sodium channel is working too much and you're absorbing excess sodium, that's also called Liddle syndrome, Liddles. Little syndrome is a hyperactive epithelial sodium channel. When the potassium side is blocked, we don't have a disease for that. When the hydrogen ion side is blocked, it's called a distal RTA. And when there's no renin, no aldosterone, insufficient hormone, that's type 4. Broken cell, not enough action, distal RTA. Insufficient hormone, type 4 RTA. Excess activity, little syndrome. So let's summarize the actions of aldosterone. Aldosterone makes you reabsorb sodium, and you get increased total body sodium. Increased total body does not mean an increased concentration. I don't understand. How can you have an increased body sodium but not have an increased level? Because you're bringing in water with it. That's why you're getting the hypertension, because you're bringing in water with it. And that's why everybody with hyperaldosteronism has hypertension and low potassium. Hypertension and low potassium. That's why everybody with hyperaldosteronism has hypertension and low potassium and a metabolic alkalosis. That's with a primary hyperaldosteronism. A primary hyperaldosteronism, 80% of the time, is an adenoma in the adrenals. It's an adrenal adenoma making aldosterone. And 15%, 18% is bilateral hyperplasia. Now, how do we know whether you've got a primary hyperaldosteronism from an adenoma or secondary hyperaldosteronism from, let's say, volume depletion? Because secondary hyperaldosteronism does not have high blood pressure. Everybody who's dry, who's dehydrated, has high aldosterone. Anybody in a hot summer or outside when you're sweating has hyperaldosteronism. But the difference between that and Conn syndrome or Cushing syndrome is the blood pressure. Secondary hyperaldosteronisms do not have high blood pressure. Well, if it isn't our friend the juxtaglomerular complex, what a happy, happy place. Because that's where our renin comes out, right? Renin senses low pressure at the JG, at the juxtaglomerular complex apparatus. Renin senses the low pressure. Also, renin is stimulated by beta stimulation. Renin is stimulated by beta stimulation. And low sodium off the macula densa. Beta stimulation, low blood pressure, and low sodium, stimulating the juxtaglomerular apparatus to make renin. So the sensory input to the juxtaglomerular complex, there's some modified smooth muscle cells. They sense the stretch. It's monitoring that pressure. They sense the low circulating volume. They sense the pressure. Low pressure, low stretch equals renin. But they're also innervated by sympathetic neurons, specifically beta 1. Now, this is part of the reason that beta blockers lower blood pressure. Beta blockers can lower blood pressure because they're also blocking renin. And the renin, remember, is induced by hypovolemia and increased sympathetic. Remember, beta 1, beta 1. And the macula densa senses low sodium. Low sodium makes renin. Renin makes angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 makes aldosterone, and aldosterone reabsorbs sodium. Aldosterone reabsorbs sodium. Wow. Here's a different view, going from right to left here, of the afferent arteriole, showing the juxtaglomerular cells wrapped like a band around them. Since those juxtaglomerular cells, wrapped like a band around the afferent arteriole, sense low pressure. When you have low pressure, the juxtaglomerular cells increase the production of renin. Now, in the efferent arteriole, angiotensin 2 has its effect, but it ends up being produced by it being sensed at the afferent arteriole. You can see how close the macula densa is to the whole apparatus. And that's because we want to be able to sense here also low sodium. But macula densa detects sodium, and juxtaglomerular cells detect pressure. And that's why between low pressure and low sodium and beta stimulation, those are the three regulators of renin. Now, all of this is the absolute transformation of the management of the congestive heart failure. For 200 years, between 1782 and 1982, when William Withering had digoxin out of a foxglove plant, and the invention and approval of ACE inhibitors being originally described from snake venom, is that we thought that if you had a positive inotrope, life would be good. But it's not. Everything that lowers mortality in congestive failure has something to do with this apparatus. Beta blockers block beta 1 and lower mortality. ACE inhibitors block the angiotensin II production. ARBs block the angiotensin II effect. And spironolactone and eplerenone block aldosterone. So this mechanism here underlies the saving of many hundreds of thousands. And the long-term regulation of blood pressure and cardiac output by that RASS is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. The blood pressure is monitored by the juxtaglomerular complex, and it sends a decrease in renal perfusion, increases renin secretion, and renin converts the angiotensin to angiotensin 1. Now, we have a blocker for angiotensin 2 going out of angiotensin 1. We have ACE blockers. We have a blocker of angiotensin 2, which is the ARBs, losartan, valsartan, irbesartan, candesartan. Do we have a renin blocker? And the answer is yes. Aldosterone is a renin blocker. However, even though it blocks renin effect on angiotensinogen, it hasn't shown a mortality benefit. So the only drug that we have that hasn't shown a mortality benefit on this system is aldosterone, which is a renin blocker. All the others show benefit in mortality. Beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, spironolactone, and eplerenone blocking aldosterone. Everything except the renin blocker lowers mortality in CHF. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system regulates resistance with angiotensin II. Remember, angiotensin II is one of the most potent vasoconstrictors in the body, as well as in cardiac output, and also increases potassium excretion by angiotensin II. Angiotensin II causes potassium excretion. Now that's why ACE inhibitors raise potassium. ACE inhibitors raise potassium, and this is one of the other things about ACE inhibitors and ARBs. They block potassium excretion. That's why they also prevent digoxin toxicity by raising potassium level. So potassium is a strong stimulator of aldosterone. And so therefore, the potassium will increase aldosterone, and aldosterone excretes potassium with the principal cell. Aldosterone excretes potassium with the principal cell. So what's the effects of angiotensin II? Stimulates aldosterone. That's long-term. Fast, instant. Arterial or vasoconstrictor. Arterial or vasoconstrictor. Stimulates sodium absorption in proximal tubule. That's one of the ones that most people don't know. It also helps sodium come in. So everything about angiotensin II functionality has to do with restoring and increasing blood pressure. Everything about angiotensin II increases blood pressure. Whether it's stimulating aldosterone to make you absorb sodium and water, causing vasoconstriction, it all raises the blood pressure. Remember, if either the cardiac output goes up or the resistance goes up, your blood pressure will go up. And blood pressure and afterload are nearly synonymous. Now, one of the two things that people don't understand or know about angiotensin II, what's the difference between the person who gets the 230 and the 250, is the person who gets to 250 also knows these little fine points. It says angiotensin 2 increases ADH. Really? Yeah, and it makes you thirsty too. It increases sodium absorption in the proximal tubule. That's why we have it here twice, because most people don't understand that. Angiotensin increases sodium in the proximal tubule. Yes, angiotensin increases sodium reabsorption in the proximal tubule. Yes, angiotensin increases sodium reabsorption in the proximal tubule. Makes you thirsty. Makes the ADH go up. Oh my God, my blood pressure's going up. Ah! This slide summarizes everything. It summarizes the three stimulants to renin release, low blood pressure, sodium delivery, and beta stimulation. To release renin, it shows you that renin transforms angiotensinogen and angiotensin 1 blocked by aliskiren. It shows you that ACE inhibitors block the formation of angiotensin 2. And remember that we're very big on you knowing what blocks the effect of something versus blocking the level. Spironolactone and eplerenone block the formation of aldosterone as well as its effect. ARBs block the effect of angiotensin 2. ACE inhibitors block the level of angiotensin 2. Finishing out this section was to remind you that potassium increases aldosterone, and it does that so it will excrete potassium. A small increase in potassium causes a big increase in aldosterone. A small increase in potassium is going to result in a big increase in aldosterone. The other things with aldosterone is that it can be caused by any condition that decreases pressure in the renal artery. So aldosterone goes up from anything that lowers blood pressure. It cannot determine the etiology of it. So that means sweating, hemorrhage, dehydration, beer drinking, it's all the same. They'll all increase the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system to increase aldosterone. It cannot determine the etiology. So that is why aldosterone going up as a response to renin is very non-discriminatory in terms of overall why did the blood pressure go down. It can't tell and it doesn't kill. All it wants to know is, should we make more renin? So what decreases the aldosterone is anything that increases the blood pressure. But why would weightlessness do that? Because it takes blood out of the extremities and brings it into the central circulation. And when you bring it into the central circulation and distend those central vessels, it will look to the reticular endothelial system, and will look to the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. It will look to both of those systems as if you've got more blood pressure, and therefore weightless pulls blood and volume out of the arms and legs and into the central circulation. And that's why it is that weightlessness will end up suppressing aldosterone.